Welcome to this journey through one of the most enduring mysteries in Texas history. Before we begin, leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. We're always curious where and when these stories reach. In 1958, during a routine drought survey near Galveston Bay, a land surveyor filed a report describing something wedged in the mud of a nearly dry lake bed. Ship's timbers, rotted rope, and a brass fitting stamped with a maker's name from New Orleans dated 1819. The report was filed, forgotten, and buried in a county archive for decades. What follows is a documented account assembled from survey records, an 1821 Customs House letter, and a diver's personal journal recovered in 1984, pointing toward the last hours of Jean Lafitte's final Texas treasure ship, and why, after 2 centuries, it has never been found. By 1817, Jean Lafitte had rebuilt his empire on the ashes of Barataria. Driven from Louisiana by the U.S. Navy, he established a new base on Galveston Island, which he named Campeche. From here, Lafitte ran a smuggling operation of staggering scale. Privateering commissions from revolutionary governments in Latin America gave him legal cover to plunder Spanish shipping, and he brought the prizes back to Galveston to sell, most infamously smuggled human cargo sold in violation of the U.S. slave trade ban through a loophole involving Jim Bowie himself. Lafitte ruled Campeche like a monarch. He built a red-painted mansion called Maison Rouge, armed with cannons, and kept a personal guard of several hundred men. Ships from New Orleans, Havana, and even ports as far as Baltimore came to trade in his contraband market. For nearly 4 years, American authorities tolerated him. Galveston was technically Spanish territory, disputed and lawless, a gray zone perfect for a man who answered to no flag but his own convenience. But by 1820, patience in Washington had run out. A raid by Lafitte's own men on an American merchant vessel, one privateer captain named Brown, who overstepped even Lafitte's loose rules, gave the U.S. Navy the pretext it needed. Commodore James Biddle arrived off Galveston aboard the USS Enterprise in early 1821 with clear orders. Lafitte was to abandon the island permanently or face bombardment. Lafitte, ever the pragmatist, agreed to leave. Publicly, the story ends here. The pirate boards his flagship, the Pride, and burns Campeche to the ground before sailing into the Gulf and out of recorded history in May 1821. But the Customs House letter recovered in the 1958 survey file tells a different story about what happened in the weeks before that departure. Dated April 3, 1821, and addressed from a customs officer in New Orleans to a colleague in Galveston, the letter reads, in part, L. moving specie inland by shallow craft. Distrust the Navy will honor terms of departure. Speaks of a second cache, separate from ship's hold. The implication was significant. Lafitte, according to this letter, did not trust that the U.S. Navy would simply let him sail away with his accumulated fortune. Years of plundered gold, silver, and goods from hundreds of captured vessels. He suspected, correctly or not, that Biddle's forces intended to seize his ships once they cleared the harbor, under some pretext of piracy prosecution. So Lafitte made a decision that would never appear in any official record. He would move part of his treasure inland, away from the coast entirely, using the network of bayous, creeks, and shallow lakes that fed into Galveston Bay from the mainland. Terrain the Navy's deep-draft warships could never follow. The customs officer's letter goes on to speculate about which vessel Lafitte might use for this purpose. Something small enough to navigate the shallow inland waterways, but sturdy enough to carry a significant cargo of specie. He names a sloop called the Jeune Amélie, a vessel known to have served Lafitte's fleet as a shallow water courier between Campeche and smaller landing points along the coast. No customs record shows the Jeune Amélie ever leaving Texas waters. No record shows her being seized, sold, or scuttled at any known port. She simply vanishes from the paper trail in the same weeks that Lafitte burned Campeche and sailed away for the last time, leaving behind, if the letter is to be believed, a fortune that never made it back into the Gulf of Mexico at all. To understand where the Jeune Amélie might have gone, it helps to understand the geography Lafitte was working with, geography that the customs officer in New Orleans understood better than most, having served on Gulf Coast postings for over a decade. Galveston Bay is fed by a complex network of bayous, creeks, and small lakes, many of which were, in 1821, far less charted than the open Gulf itself. Local pilots who knew these waterways could move small, shallow draft vessels for miles inland, well beyond where any Navy warship of the period could follow. It was exactly the kind of terrain smugglers had used for generations to avoid customs enforcement, and exactly the kind of terrain Lafitte, ever resourceful, would have exploited when the situation in Galveston turned against him. A second document recovered during the 1958 survey, a fragment of a ship's manifest, water-damaged and partially illegible, lists a crew of 6 aboard an unnamed sloop departing the harbor on April 19, 1821, carrying sundry goods in specie boxes, number 4. The manifest is unsigned, but the handwriting was later compared by the 1958 investigators to known Lafitte correspondence held in New Orleans archives, and found to bear strong similarities to the hand of Lafitte's clerk, a man named Beluche, who served as his second-in-command's brother. If the manifest is accurate, 4 boxes of specie, likely gold and silver coin, given the term specie used throughout period customs documents, left Galveston Harbor 6 days before Lafitte's public, recorded departure on May 7, 1821. Local oral history, collected by Texas folklorists decades later and compiled in a 1961 regional history journal, describes a persistent story among families who settled the area around a small freshwater lake, later named Lake Miller, near the mouth of a tributary of the Trinity River. The story held that a pirate boat had come up the tributary during the trouble at Galveston, a phrase locals used for generations to refer, without much precision, to Lafitte's departure, and had never come back out. One version of the story, recorded from an elderly resident in 1961, claimed her grandmother had told her that her own grandfather, as a boy, had seen men in a small boat working by torchlight on the lake's edge one night in the spring of 1821, burying something before dawn. The men left before sunrise, and the boy's family, wary of pirates and wary of trouble, never spoke of it to authorities. Whether this story reflects a real memory passed down through 5 generations, or simply absorbed the broader Lafitte treasure mythology that spread across the Gulf Coast in the decades after his disappearance, is impossible to verify. But the detail of burying something before dawn near a lake that would, over a century later, yield ship's timbers and a New Orleans-stamped brass fitting during a 1958 drought survey is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The customs officer's original letter offers one more detail worth noting. He speculated that Lafitte would not entrust such a valuable cargo to just any crew, that whoever commanded the Jeune Amélie on this inland detour would need to be someone Lafitte trusted completely, likely a senior lieutenant, and that this same lieutenant would be expected to rejoin Lafitte's main fleet in the Gulf once the cash was secured. No lieutenant matching this description is recorded as having sailed with Lafitte after May 1821. The 6 men named in the fragmentary manifest, insofar as their names remain legible, do not appear in any later Lafitte correspondence, crew list, or historical account of his subsequent years in the Caribbean. They disappear from history at the exact same moment the treasure does. The 1958 drought that exposed the timbers in Lake Miller was, by regional accounts, one of the worst in decades. Water levels across much of southeast Texas dropped precipitously, and county surveyors were dispatched throughout the area to assess property boundaries that had shifted with the receding shorelines. Routine, unglamorous work that, in this case, uncovered something nobody expected. The surveyor's report, filed with Chambers County and later transferred to the State Archive during a 1970s records consolidation, describes the find in dry, procedural language typical of the period. Timbers consistent with vessel hull construction, partially exposed, lakebed sector 4. Approximate length of visible structure 30 feet. Brass fitting recovered. Stamped New Orleans foundry mark. Legible date 1819. Site photographed. Recommend further examination by qualified party. That further examination never happened, at least not through official channels. The report was filed, a copy forwarded to the State Historical Commission, and no action was taken. Texas in 1958 had considerably more pressing archaeological and historical priorities, and a partially exposed hull in a small private lake, without any accompanying treasure or human remains, simply didn't rise to the level of state interest. It might have stayed buried in bureaucratic obscurity indefinitely if not for a private diver named Walter Reese, who read a brief mention of the survey findings in a regional newspaper article in 1961. One of the few times the discovery received any public attention at all. Reese, an amateur historian and recreational diver with an interest in Gulf Coast shipwrecks, obtained permission from the property's owners to dive the lake himself over several weekends in 1962 and 1963. His personal journal, donated to a regional historical society by his family after his death in 1984, and rediscovered only when a volunteer archivist began cataloging the collection decades later, describes his dives in considerable, sometimes frustrated detail. June 14, 1962, he wrote, "Visibility poor, silt disturbed easily. Located what I believe to be the timber structure described in the 58 report. Hull appears to run at an angle, bow deeper than stern, consistent with a vessel that settled unevenly, perhaps scuttled deliberately rather than sunk by accident." Reese's later entries grow more detailed as he mapped the site across multiple dives. He recovered several small artifacts: ship's fittings, a corroded buckle, fragments of what he believed to be a wooden chest, but never in 3 years of diving located anything resembling the specie boxes, number 4, described in the 1821 manifest fragment. September 3, 1963, reads one of his final entries. "I'm now convinced the cargo, if it was ever here, was removed before the vessel was scuttled, or moved elsewhere entirely after the crew came ashore. The hull tells a story of deliberate abandonment, not disaster. Someone chose to sink this boat and chose to do it carefully." Reese's theory, that the ship had been intentionally scuttled after its cargo was already unloaded and moved elsewhere on land, would come to dominate later speculation about the site. It also, troublingly, raised a question nobody could answer. If the treasure had been moved off the ship and buried somewhere on land near the lake, where exactly had it gone? And why had none of the 6 men named in the 1821 manifest ever surfaced again, in any record, anywhere? Among the artifacts Walter Reese's estate donated to the Historical Society decades later was a small, badly corroded signet ring recovered from the lake bed during his 1963 dives. For years it sat uncatalogued, dismissed by an early volunteer as probably nothing, probably 20th century. It wasn't until a more thorough cataloging effort, conducted alongside the rediscovery of Reese's journal, that a historian familiar with early Gulf Coast privateering recognized the ring's engraved initials, J.D., and cross-referenced them against known associates of Jean Lafitte. Jean Deschamps was a name that appeared exactly twice in surviving Lafitte-era correspondence, once in an 1819 Customs House complaint about smuggled cargo attributed to Deschamps, acting for Lafitte, and once more in a private letter from a Galveston merchant describing Deschamps as the captain's most trusted lieutenant, a man of few words but absolute loyalty. He is not mentioned again in any surviving record after April 1821. If Deschamps commanded the Jeune Amélie on its inland detour, a plausible but unprovable inference, given his seniority and the timing, then the ring recovered from the lake bed may be the closest anyone has come to physical evidence of his fate. Rees's journal notes the ring was found near the stern section of the wreck, not the bow, which he speculated might suggest a struggle or a hasty abandonment near that part of the vessel. A final piece of the puzzle comes from an unexpected source, a brief 1823 entry in the personal diary of a Chambers County settler named Josiah Pruitt, whose land bordered the lake at the time. Pruitt's diary, held for generations by his descendants before being donated to a local historical society in the 1970s, was never connected to the Lafitte story until a researcher cross-referencing Rees's dive logs noticed the geographic overlap. "Found a man's boot near the creek bank this morning," Pruitt wrote in an entry dated March 1823, nearly 2 years after Lafitte's departure from Galveston. "Fine leather, not local make. No sign of the man himself. Wife says leave it be. This land has had strange visitors before and will again." Pruitt's diary contains no further mention of the boot, the lake, or any suspicious visitors, and the entry might mean nothing at all. A lost boot is hardly proof of anything, but taken alongside the ring, the scuttled hull, and the 6 names that vanish from history in the same 6-day window in April 1821, it forms part of a pattern that Walter Rees and later researchers found difficult to explain away as coincidence. Whatever happened to Jean Deschamps and the 5 men who sailed with him, they did not rejoin Lafitte's fleet in the Gulf. They do not appear in Caribbean privateering records, in Louisiana census documents, or in any account of Lafitte's later years before his death, likely off the coast of Honduras, sometime around 1823. The most persistent theory, favored by Rees in his later journal entries and echoed by researchers since, is a grim one. That pursuit by American forces, or simply the brutal difficulty of navigating unfamiliar inland waterways under pressure, cost the small crew their lives before they could complete their mission, leaving the treasure, if it was ever unloaded at all, buried somewhere along a shoreline that has changed considerably in the 2 centuries since. News of Rees's dives and his eventual theory spread slowly through amateur treasure hunting circles in the decades that followed, aided by a handful of regional newspaper features and eventually a brief section devoted to the Lake Miller wreck in a 1979 book on Gulf Coast pirate legends. The site attracted a steady trickle of amateur searchers over the following decades, some with metal detectors working the shoreline, others attempting their own dives with considerably less rigor than Rees had applied. None reported finding anything resembling Lafitte's missing specie boxes. Several reported finding nothing at all beyond fishing tackle and modern debris. A more serious archaeological survey was finally conducted in 1988, coordinated between a state historical commission and a team of maritime archaeologists interested in confirming or dismissing the site's connection to Lafitte once and for all. Using more advanced equipment than Rees had access to in the 1960s, the team confirmed the presence of a vessel hull consistent with an early 19th century shallow draft sloop, and recovered additional period-appropriate artifacts, including ballast stones and further hull fragments. Their report, however, was notably cautious about the Lafitte connection specifically. While the vessel is consistent in period and construction with vessels known to have operated in Lafitte's fleet, the 1988 report states, there is no artifact recovered from this site that definitively confirms its identity as the Jeune Amélie, nor any physical evidence of the specie cargo described in period correspondence. The connection to Lafitte, while historically plausible and supported by circumstantial documentary evidence, remains unproven. This is, in essence, where the case has remained for the decades since. The hull is real. The customs officer's letter is real and held today in a New Orleans archival collection. The manifest fragment, the signet ring, Pruitt's diary entry, all of it exists. All of it has been examined by historians and archaeologists, and none of it, taken individually, proves anything conclusively. Taken together, they form one of the most compelling circumstantial cases in American treasure lore. A real ship sunk in a real place in the exact window of time when a real pirate king was fleeing a real Navy ultimatum, accompanied by real men who vanished from every subsequent record without explanation. Local families around the lake still tell versions of the burial story passed down from the 1961 recording, embellished and altered across generations the way such stories tend to be. Metal detector enthusiasts still occasionally request permission to search the property. The lake itself, smaller now than it was in the 1950s due to decades of regional development and water table changes, sits quietly on private land, its muddy bottom holding whatever secrets it still has left to give up. Walter Reese never lived to see the 1988 survey that confirmed at least part of what he'd spent 3 summers of his life trying to prove. His journal's final entry, dated October 1963, reads simply, "Have done what I can with what I have. The lake will keep its own counsel until someone with better tools than mine comes along. I believe there was a fortune here once. I believe men died bringing it. I do not believe it has left this ground." 2 centuries after Jean Lafitte sailed out of Galveston Bay for the last recorded time, the question of what happened to his final Texas fortune remains exactly that, a question unresolved and likely to stay that way. The known facts are these. A customs officer in New Orleans believed, based on direct correspondence, that Lafitte moved treasure inland rather than risk losing it to the U.S. Navy. A manifest fragment tentatively linked to Lafitte's clerk by handwriting analysis records 4 boxes of specie leaving Galveston Harbor 6 days before Lafitte's public departure. A vessel matching the period and construction of ships in Lafitte's fleet lies scuttled in a small Texas lake, discovered by chance during a 1958 drought survey. A signet ring bearing the initials of Lafitte's most trusted lieutenant was recovered from that same wreck, and 6 men, the lieutenant among them, disappear from every subsequent historical record in the exact same window of time. What remains unknown, and will likely remain unknown, is where, if anywhere, the treasure itself ended up. Walter Reese believed it was unloaded before the ship was scuttled. If he was right, it could be buried anywhere along a shoreline that has shifted considerably over 200 years of erosion, drought, flood, and development. If he was wrong, and the cargo went down with the ship, it may simply have been quietly recovered by someone at some point in the intervening 2 centuries and never reported, an outcome no less plausible than the alternative, and impossible to disprove. The 1988 archaeological team, in the final section of their report, offered a note of professional restraint that historians studying the case have since come to see as the closest thing to a final word the evidence allows. Absence of proof is not proof of absence, the report states, but neither should absence of proof be mistaken for confirmation of legend. What can be said with confidence is that something significant happened at this location in the spring of 1821, involving men connected to Lafitte's operation under circumstances that were never resolved and likely never will be. For the families who have lived along the shores of Lake Miller for generations, the story has become less a mystery to be solved than a piece of inherited history, something told to children on summer evenings, embellished a little more with each retelling, but rooted, unlike so much treasure lore, in documents that genuinely exist and hold up, at least partially, to scrutiny. Jean Lafitte himself vanished from history not long after, his final years poorly documented, his death likely occurring off the coast of Honduras around 1823, fighting, as he had always fought, on his own terms and by his own rules. Whatever fortune he left behind in a quiet Texas lake 6 days before the world last saw him sail from Galveston has kept its silence for 200 years. It may keep it for 200 more.